The thing about truth is that it doesn't announce itself with trumpets or dramatic music. It just shows up in your kitchen at 3 a.m., wearing the face of a 17-year-old girl with hands rubbed raw from dish soap, and it dares you to look away. Daniel Whitmore had spent 68 years building walls between himself and the messy realities of other people. Lives mansions with marble hallways so long you could forget there was a world beyond them. Boardrooms where decisions moved billions but never touched a single trembling hand. But on this particular Thursday night, in his sprawling Boston estate, overlooking the dark Atlantic waters, those walls came crashing down because of a sound he wasn't supposed to hear. The delicate clink of crystal against granite, the soft, desperate rhythm of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. See, most people think insomnia is just about not sleeping. But Daniel knew better. It's about being awake when the world reveals things that daylight carefully hides. And this night, descending from his library with a book on Roman emperors, he couldn't focus on. He was about to stumble into something that would change everything he thought he understood about sacrifice, pride, and the debts we carry across generations. Emily Carter wasn't supposed to be there, scrubbing the aftermath of Daniel's 30-person gala dinner like her life depended on it. When he pushed open that heavy oak door and flicked on the industrial kitchen lights, flooding the cavernous room with sterile brightness. He saw her flinch like she'd been caught committing a crime. Her blonde hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat and dishwater. Her uniform hung loose on a frame that had clearly missed too many meals. Those hands, Lord, those hands were red and swollen from hours of scrubbing. The hands of someone who'd been doing this night after night, while her classmates were posting prom pictures and college acceptance letters. But here's what caught Daniel's attention. What made his brilliant, pattern-recognizing mind suddenly go on high alert? That faded blue backpack slumped by the service door, and dangling from its zipper, bright as a beacon in the harsh kitchen light, a blue and gold honor cord. The kind valedictorians wear, the kind that screams, "This girl has a future." Except futures don't wash dishes at 3 a.m. Unless something has gone terribly, desperately wrong. And if you've ever felt that pit in your stomach when you realize someone is suffering in silence right under your nose, when you see something that just doesn't fit and know you can just walk away and pretend you didn't. See it, then you'll understand why Daniel didn't turn around and go back to bed. You'll understand why he stood there, silk robe pulled tight against the cold, and asked the one question that would change 3 lives forever. Who are you, and what are you doing in my kitchen? Now, you might be sitting there thinking, why didn't she just ask for help? That's the question of someone who's never had to choose between pride and survival. Emily's terror wasn't just about being caught trespassing in a billionaire. Mansion. It was the terror of her carefully constructed house of cards collapsing, of her mother Linda losing the one job that provided their lifeline, of everything they'd been desperately hiding tumbling into the light, where people like Daniel Whitmore could see just how close they were to complete collapse. She stammered out a lie something about her mother having a bad cold, about wanting to help out, about being almost done. And Daniel, who'd built a shipping empire by reading people's faces across negotiation tables, knew instantly that this girl was lying. More importantly, he knew she was lying to protect someone. When he looked at that honor cord, when he saw the old military photo tucked in her backpack S-mesh pocket showing a stern-faced soldier in uniform, when he registered the exhaustion carved into this child S-face like she'd been fighting a war nobody knew about, something clicked. His mind made a connection he couldn't yet fully understand. A whisper from a battlefield half a world away, about duty and sacrifice and the people who carry burdens so others don't have to. He didn't push her, didn't demand explanations. Instead, with a quietness that surprised even himself, he told her to leave the dishes, to go home, to get some sleep. And as she grabbed that heavy backpack and slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness of the Boston suburbs, Daniel stood alone in his massive empty kitchen and felt something he hadn't felt in decades, the uncomfortable, insistent pull of a mystery that demanded solving not for profit or strategy, but because some truths refused to stay hidden. And as the first grey light of morning began to creep through the windows of his waterfront estate, Daniel Whitmore picked up his phone. He'd just spotted a pattern that didn't make sense. And when patterns don't make sense, when valedictorians wash dishes at 3:00 a.m. and terror lives in the eyes of 17-year-old girls, it means someone's hiding something. Daniel had built his entire fortune on one simple principle. Hidden things, when brought into the light, always reveal the path forward. He was done looking away. Sometimes the smallest details tell the biggest stories. A worn-out backpack, a dangling cord, a photograph tucked into a side pocket, and if you're the kind of person who pays attention, who doesn't just look but actually sees, then you know these aren't just objects. They're clues to lives being lived in the shadows where most people never bother to glance. Daniel Whitmore had made his fortune reading the fine print, spotting the tiny discrepancies in shipping manifests that saved millions, noticing the hesitation in a competitor's voice that revealed weakness, and standing in his industrial kitchen at 3:15 a.m., watching Emily Carter tremble like a deer caught in headlights. Every instinct he'd honed over 68 years was screaming that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. She was too exhausted, too young, too terrified for this to be a simple case of a daughter helping her sick mother. The lie she'd told about a bad cold, about just wanting to help out, was delivered with the desperation of someone protecting something far bigger than a weekend chore. And Daniel, who'd spent decades negotiating with some of the sharpest minds in global business, could smell desperation from a mile away. It had a particular scent, like metal and fear and love all mixed together. Emily had that scent all over her. He didn't press her though, not yet. Because here's something most people don't understand about getting to the truth. Sometimes you have to let people think they've gotten away with the lie. You have to give them enough rope, enough space, enough false security that they stop watching their backs. So Daniel simply told her to go home, to leave the dishes, to get some sleep. His voice was kind but firm, the voice of someone who wasn't asking permission. And as Emily fumbled with her heavy backpack, her hands still shaking, Daniel watched with the focused intensity of a man solving a puzzle. That S, when he saw it hanging from the main zipper, like a banner announcing something extraordinary. A blue and gold honor cord. The kind they give to valedictorians, to students who've clawed their way to the very top of the academic mountain, who've earned scholarships and futures and everything this girl was apparently throwing away to scrub his kitchen at 3:00 a.m. Daniel's mind, which never stopped analyzing, calculating, predicting, shifted into overdrive. Valedictorians don't wash billionaires' dishes in the dead of night. They don't skip school. They don't lie with that kind of bone-deep terror unless they re-protecting something or someone they die for. And then there was the photograph in the mesh side pocket, partially visible. A young man in military dress uniform, his face stern and proud, the kind of face that belonged to a different era, a different war, the kind of face that reminded Daniel of ghosts he'd spent 50 years trying not to think about. Emily slipped out the service door into the pre-dawn cold, and Daniel stood alone in his massive kitchen, surrounded by dirty dishes and unanswered questions. He looked at the sink, still piled high with crystal and china. He looked at the space where that backpack had been. The pattern was broken, and broken patterns were like puzzles begging to be solved. They itched at the back of your mind, demanded attention, refused to let you sleep until you figured out what piece was missing. Most people would have shrugged it off, gone back to bed, forgotten the whole strange encounter by morning. But Daniel Whitmore wasn't most people. He was a man who'd built an empire by trusting his instincts, by following the threads that others overlooked, by understanding that small mysteries often revealed massive truths. He walked to his study, poured himself a scotch he wouldn't drink, and sat in his leather chair as the Boston skyline began to lighten from black to grey. At exactly 7 a.m., when he knew his head of operations would be awake, he picked up his phone and called Harold Benson. "Hal," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made, "I need you to do something for me. Our housekeeper, Linda Carter, spent any plans to let her go, and her daughter Emily, 17, senior in high school. I want everything. School records, grades, attendance, scholarships, everything." There was a pause on the line. Hal had worked with Daniel for 20 years and knew better than to ask too many questions. "Of course, sir. May I ask what this is regarding?" Daniel looked out at the water, at the early morning light dancing across the waves. "To broken pattern, Hal, and you know how I feel about broken patterns." He hung up and waited. Because if there's one thing life teaches you when you've lived as long as Daniel had, it's that the truth always comes out eventually. You just have to know where to shine the light. And if you've ever noticed something that didn't quite add up, something that made you stop and pay attention when everyone else just walked by, then you understand exactly what Daniel was feeling in that moment. That instinct that says this matters is worth trusting, and if this story is resonating with you, if you're feeling that same pull to see where this truth leads, go ahead and let me know. Because stories like this, about people finding each other across impossible distances, across decades of silence and debt and honor, these are the stories that remind us why paying attention matters. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone hands you a folder containing information you didn't want to be true. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of something heavier, something that changes the weight of the air itself, makes it harder to breathe, forces you to confront the fact that the world is more broken than you allowed yourself to believe. Daniel Whitmore knew that silence well. He'd felt it when his mother opened the telegram about his brother Tommy. He'd felt it when his first business partner betrayed him. And he felt it again at 4:00 p.m. on that grey Boston afternoon when Harold Benson walked into his mahogany study, placed a thin manila folder on the desk, and said in a voice that was almost apologetic, "Sir, you were right about the girl." Hal never looked rattled. 20 years of working with Daniel had trained him to maintain composure through hurricanes, hostile takeovers, and billion-dollar disasters. But today, standing in the golden afternoon light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Hal looked shaken. He looked like a man who just stumbled across an injustice so profound it had knocked something loose in his carefully ordered worldview. And if you've ever been the person who had to deliver bad news, who had to be the messenger carrying truths that would change everything, then you know exactly what was written on Hal's face. This isn't just information. This is a tragedy unfolding in real time. Daniel opened the folder with steady hands, though his heart had started that familiar, uncomfortable pounding that meant he was about to learn something he couldn't unlearn. The first page was a printout from Harbor Ridge High School's website, a photograph of Emily Carter, beaming, holding a certificate, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that only exists before life teaches you about impossible choices. The caption read, "Emily Carter named County Valedictorian, perfect 4.0 GPAs, full academic scholarship to Jefferson University." Daniel's eyes moved to the second page. U.S. Presidential Scholar, one of 160 students in the entire nation. He'd been right about the honor cord. This wasn't just a good student skipping school. This was a national treasure being buried alive. "Go on, Hal," Daniel said, his voice carefully controlled, though fury was building in his chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Hal slid another paper across the polished desk-can attendance report from the school district, covered in red marks like wounds. 25 days ago, sir, Emily Carter stopped attending school. completely. The principal at Harbour Ridge has been calling the home number disconnected. She sent letters, no response. Emily is now marked for chronic truancy. She's missed the deadline to accept the scholarship. Jefferson University has moved on to the alternate candidate. The waste of it hit Daniel like a physical blow, not just waste destruction. Here was a girl who'd done everything right, who'd played by all the rules, who'd earned her way to the top through sheer brilliance and hard work, and she was throwing it all away. Or rather, something was forcing her to throw it away. Because girls like Emily Carter don't just quit. They don't just walk away from futures they've spent 17 years building. Something or someone had broken the pattern. And Daniel Whitmore had built his entire empire on one fundamental belief. When patterns break, it's because something important is hiding in the shadows, waiting to be dragged into the light. The third page explained everything, and it was worse than Daniel had imagined. But Hull's voice was quiet, almost reverent, like he was reading a eulogy. I spoke with several sources, sir. Emily's mother, Linda Carter, your housekeeper, was diagnosed 2 months ago. The timeline matches exactly. Daniel's hand froze on the paper. Diagnosed with what? Aggressive lupus, sir. The kind that attacks fast, that doesn't respond to standard treatments. Hal paused, gathering himself. There's a new medication that's showing real results, but the insurance company, the basic plan we provide, has denied coverage. They're calling it experimental. The out-of-pocket cost is $900 per month just for the prescription. That's not counting specialists, blood work, or follow-up care. $900. Daniel stared at the number on the page. To him, it was nothing. A rounding error. The cost of dinner at one of his usual restaurants. Less than what he'd paid for the scotch sitting untouched on his desk. But to Linda and Emily Carter, $900 per month was the price of survival land. They couldn't pay it. Hal continued, his voice steady but laced with anger. Linda lost her second job at a dry cleaning business. Too many sick days. Your position here, this is all they have left, sir. The paycheck and the health insurance, even if it doesn't cover what she really needs. Daniel felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Emily had stopped going to school 25 days ago. The same week her mother's condition must have become undeniable. The same week the choice became stark and terrible. Your future or your mother's life. And Emily, brave, foolish, loving Emily, had made the only choice a daughter could make. She'd walked away from Washington, D.C., from the scholarship, from everything she'd earned. And she'd done it silently, without complaint, covering her mother's shifts at the mansion to keep the job safe. Working a second job somewhere to scrape together money for medicine that cost more than most people's rent. She'd disappeared into the shadows to save the one person who mattered most, and the world had moved on without her redistributing. Her scholarship to someone else, marking her as truant, treating her like a failure when she was actually the most. Successful person in the whole damn story because she succeeded at love even when it meant failing at everything else. And if you've ever wondered whether one person can make a difference, whether noticing matters, whether stepping into someone else's darkness is worth the trouble, then stay with this story, because you're about to see what happens when someone finally refuses to look away. You know, there are millions of stories like Emily's playing out right now in kitchens and apartments and cold rooms all across this country, people sacrificing everything in silence, hoping nobody notices how close they are to collapse. And the only way these stories get told, the only way the truth comes out of the shadows and into the light where it can actually change things, is if people like you stick around to hear them all the way through. Because this isn't just entertainment, this is about remembering what matters. About seeing the Emily Carters in our own lives before it's too late. So if you're tracking with this, if you want to see how this impossible situation gets resolved, make sure you don't miss what happens next. When you've built an empire from nothing, when you've navigated storms that would have sunk lesser men, you learn to separate emotion from action, to feel the anger, absorb the injustice, and then channel it all into something useful, something that actually moves the needle. Daniel Whitmore sat in his study as the afternoon light faded to dusk, the manila folder still open on his desk, and he felt that familiar transition happening inside him, the shift from shock to strategy, from observer to operator. He spent the morning learning that a national treasure was being destroyed by a $900 monthly prescription. Now came the part he was good at, fixing things that shouldn't be broken. But first, he needed to understand the full picture. How, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The mother, Linda. You said she's been hiding this from me for 2 months. Hal nodded, still standing by the window, backlit by the grey Boston skyline. She's been covering her shifts, sir. Or rather, Emily has been covering them unpaid, after school and on weekends, before she stopped attending entirely. They've been running a deception to keep you from discovering Linda's condition. They couldn't risk losing this job. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, not anger at them, but at himself. How had he not noticed? How had a woman been collapsing under the weight of disease right under his roof while he'd been reviewing shipping routes and profit margins? The answer was simple and damning. He hadn't been paying attention. He'd built walls so high between himself and his staff that human suffering could hide in the gaps. And if you ever realized you were complicit in someone else's pain simply by not looking hard enough, by not asking the right questions, then you know the particular flavor of guilt that was settling into Daniel's bones, the kind that demands immediate action, that won't let you sleep until you've at least tried to make it right. Hal cleared his throat, pulling out one more document from his briefcase, the kind of thorough research Daniel had trained him to conduct. There's something else, sir, something I found when I was digging into Linda's background. He slid a faded military record across the desk. Linda's father, Emily's grandfather, was Captain James Carter, 101st Airborne Division, Baker Company. Served 2 tours. Highly decorated, passed away in 2010. The name hit Daniel like a punch to the solar plexus. Baker Company, the words echoed in his head, dragging him back 50 years to a place he'd spent decades trying not to think about, to jungle heat and telegram deliveries, and his mother's face when she learned her oldest son wasn't coming home. Baker Company, Daniel repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand moved almost unconsciously to the framed photograph on his bookshelf, one he kept but rarely looked at. Young men in fatigues, smiling despite everything. Arms slung over each other's shoulders in that particular way soldiers do when they know they might not all make it home. His brother Tommy was in that photo, tall and grinning, standing next to a stern-faced captain with kind eyes. Captain James Carter, the man who'd written 3 letters to Daniel's mother. Letters that had arrived weeks after the funeral letters that had described Tommy's last moments with a tenderness that only someone who'd been there, who'd held his hand, who'd promised he wouldn't die alone, could possibly convey. Those letters hadn't brought Tommy back, but they'd given Daniel's mother something to hold on to. Besides grief, they'd given her peace, the knowledge that her son had been brave and loved and not forgotten. And now, 50 years later, that captain's granddaughter was washing Daniel's dishes at 3 a.m., sacrificing her entire future to keep her mother alive, and Daniel hadn't even known the connection existed. The universe, it seemed, had a long memory and a dark sense of irony. "Get me their address," Daniel said, standing up abruptly. The decision was made. The pattern was complete. This wasn't just about helping an employee anymore. This was about a debt that transcended paychecks and professional courtesy, a debt that reached back through decades to a jungle clearing where good men died and good men stayed behind to write letters to strangers. "Sir." Hall's voice carried a note of concern. "It's nearly 6 p.m. Perhaps tomorrow would be now how?" Daniel's voice left no room for negotiation. "I need to see Linda Carter tonight. And I need to know where Emily is right now. If she's working another job, I want the location." Hal pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. According to a contact at the school, Emily mentioned working evenings. "Let me make some calls." While Hal worked his phone, Daniel walked to his bookshelf and carefully removed the old photograph. He stared at the faces, Tommy's bright eyes, Captain Carter's protective stance. He'd never met James Carter in person, never had the chance to thank him for those letters, for that final act of kindness toward a grieving mother. But he could thank the captain's family now. He could step into their darkness the way James Carter had stepped into his mother's. Because here's what Daniel understood in that moment, what maybe you understand too if you've ever carried guilt for too long, if you'd ever gotten a second chance to make something right that you thought was forever broken. The truth doesn't care about timing or convenience. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It shows up in your kitchen at 3 a.m., or in a manila folder on a Thursday afternoon, or in a 50-year-old photograph of men who promised to leave no one behind, and it demands that you act. Found her, Hal said, looking up from his phone with an expression that was equal parts relief and dismay. Emily's working at a place called the Midnight Star Diner. Graveyard shift. Started 3 weeks ago. Daniel grabbed his coat, the expensive wool feeling suddenly absurd, like a costume. Give me the address. And how clear my schedule for tomorrow. All of it, because the truth was finally coming out of the shadows, and Daniel Whitmore was done being a bystander in other people's tragedies. He'd spent 50 years building an empire while avoiding the debts that really mattered. Tonight, that ended. You know what strikes me about stories like this? It is how often the people who deserve help the most are the ones too proud to ask for it. The ones working 2 jobs in silence while the world walks by without noticing. And I wonder, have you ever been the Emily in this story, sacrificing in secret? Or maybe you've been the Daniel, finally waking up to suffering you should have seen sooner. Drop your thoughts below, because these conversations, these moments where we admit that we see each other, that we're paying attention, that's where real change starts. Not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the comment section at 10 p.m, when someone finally says, "Yeah, I've been there too, and here's what I learned." The address Hal provided led Daniel to a part of Boston he hadn't seen in 40 years, the kind of neighborhood that used to be called working class before that phrase became a polite euphemism for barely surviving. Maplewood Towers was a grey, weathered apartment complex that looked like it had given up trying to impress anyone sometime in the 1970s. The concrete stairs were cracked. The hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner and something deeper. Sadder, the scent of people living one paycheck away from disaster, of families holding on by their fingernails. Daniel climbed 3 flights, his expensive leather shoes echoing in the stairwell, and knocked on apartment 3B. The sound seemed too loud, too intrusive, like he was announcing the arrival of judgment itself. Inside, he heard slow, painful shuffling, the kind of movement that spoke of joints that didn't bend right anymore, of a body betraying its owner one day at a time. The door opened a crack, held by a chain lock. A single eye peered out wide, terrified, the eye of someone who'd been expecting bad news for so long that any knock on the door became a potential catastrophe. "Mrs. Carter," Daniel said, his voice gentle despite the authority he naturally carried. "My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm your employer. May I come in?" The door slammed shut, not in anger, but in panic. Daniel heard a muffled sob, then the rattle of the chain being fumbled open with hands that clearly didn't want to cooperate. When the door opened again, Linda Carter stood there leaning heavily on a metal walker. And Daniel understood immediately why Emily had been willing to sacrifice everything. This wasn't the neat, capable housekeeper who'd managed his home for 5 years. This was a ghost of that woman aged 20 years in 2 months. Linda's face was grey with pain, her skin pulled tight over bones that seemed to be consuming her from the inside. Her hands, gripping the walker, were swollen into twisted claws, the joints red and angry, the fingers bent at angles that made Daniel's own hands ache in sympathy. She was wearing a clean sweater and slacks, her dignity still intact even if her body was falling apart. But she was trembling either from cold or pain or the sheer terror of having her boss show up unannounced at her tiny apartment. "Mr. Whitmore," she gasped, her voice thick with shame and fear. "I was going to call. I just been." She couldn't finish the sentence. The words got tangled up with emotion, with the desperate calculations running through her head about how to explain, how to justify, how to keep from losing the one lifeline she had left. Daniel stepped inside without waiting for invitation, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. The apartment was spotless. Linda had clearly been raised to believe cleanliness was next to godliness. Even when your body was betraying you, but it was cold. Brutally cold. A single electric space heater glowed weakly in the corner, barely making a dent in the chill. The furniture was old, but well-maintained, the kind passed down through generations because buying new wasn't an option. And everywhere taped to walls and stacked on the small dining table were medical bills. Hundreds of them. Thousands of dollars in paper reminders that healthcare in America was a luxury, not a right, and that insurance companies had perfected the art of saying no in the most clinical, impersonal language possible. "I saw Emily last night," Daniel said, and the words hit Linda like a physical blow. She sank onto the worn sofa, the walker clattering beside her, and her face crumpled into an expression of such complete despair that Daniel had to look away for a moment. "Oh God," Linda whispered, tears rolling down her pale cheeks. She promised, "I told her not to go there. I told her I could still work. I just needed a few more days." Her voice broke on the last word, and Daniel understood the full weight of what Emily had been carrying. Linda hadn't just been sick, she'd been trying to hide it while her body was literally eating itself alive. Trying to keep up the pretense that everything was fine, that she could still scrub floors and wash windows and manage a billionaire's household while lupus turned her hands into useless, painful appendages. She'd been living in this cold apartment, stretching every dollar, disconnecting the phone to save $40 a month, all while her 17-year-old daughter watched her mother disappear and made the most terrible, loving decision a child could make. Daniel's eyes moved around the small living room, cataloging details. An old photograph of Linda and Emily at a high school graduation, Millie beaming, Linda proud. A shelf of books about history and government, clearly Emily's. And there, partially hidden behind a stack of medical bills on the small desk, he saw it, a cream-colored envelope with an embossed seal, the kind of envelope that carries good news, important news. Daniel walked over and picked it up before Linda could stop him. It was from the White House, the Presidential Scholars Commission, congratulating Emily Carter on her selection as one of the nation's top students, offering her recognition, opportunity, a future, and it was dated 4 weeks ago, right when Emily had stopped going to school. The scholarship, Daniel said quietly, holding the letter like it was evidence in a trial. The full ride to Jefferson University, the Presidential Scholar Award. Linda's face went white, then red. Then she made a sound that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a scream. It was something deeper, more primal, the sound of a mother's heart breaking in real time. "I found it in the trash," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found it in the kitchen trash can, crumpled up like it was nothing, like it didn't matter." She gripped her own hair with those twisted, painful hands. I asked her why, and she just looked at me with those empty, tired eyes and said, "What's a scholarship, Mum? Does it pay for your medicine? Does it keep the lights on?" The truth was finally out in the open, naked and terrible. Emily had made the calculation that no child should ever have to make, her future versus her mother's life, and she'd chosen love over ambition, sacrifice over success, the present over the future. Because when someone is drowning, philosophy about long-term planning doesn't matter. All that matters is keeping their head above water one more day, one more week, one more $900 prescription at a time. Daniel looked at Linda, at this woman who'd cleaned his house while her body betrayed her, who'd raised a daughter so good, so pure, so selfless that she'd thrown away everything to save her mother. And he made a decision that had been building since 3 a.m. in his kitchen. Since Hal had handed him that manila folder, since he'd seen the photograph of Captain James Carter and remembered those letters, those precious letters that had saved his own mother from drowning in grief 50 years ago. "Where is Emily now?" Daniel asked. Linda looked up, confusion cutting through her despair. She's at work. The diner, the Midnight Star. She works the evening shift so she can be here during the day, in case I fall. Daniel nodded once, sharply. "Stay here. Lock your door. I'll be back." He walked to the door, then paused, turning back to Linda. "One more thing, Mrs. Carter. That phone number, the disconnected one, what company?" "Metro Communications," Linda said, bewildered. "But we can't afford it LLB reconnected by morning," Daniel said, "along with the heat." And then he was gone, leaving Linda sitting alone in her cold apartment, holding a White House letter, wondering if she'd just hallucinated the last 10 minutes. The thing is, there are probably a dozen families on Linda S. Street right now making the exact same impossible calculations: medicine or rent, heat or food, a child's future or a parent's present. Stories like this don't go viral because they're unusual. They go viral because they're common, because everyone knows an Emily or has been an Emily, and the only way these patterns ever change is when enough people decide to share the truth instead of hiding it in the shadows. So if this story is hitting you somewhere deep, if you're thinking about someone who needs to hear it, maybe don't keep it to yourself. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to pretend everything is fine when it clearly isn't. The Midnight Star Diner sat on a forgotten stretch of Route 9, the kind of place truck drivers and third-shift workers frequented because it was cheap, open late, and didn't ask questions. Daniel pulled his modest sedan out, the Rolls-Royce. He'd had enough sense for that into the half-empty parking lot and sat for a moment, engine idling, staring at the building through the windshield. It was exactly what he'd expected. Bright fluorescent lights bleeding through greasy windows, a neon sign missing 2 letters so it just read Midnight Star, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a place where people came not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Inside those walls, his housekeeper's daughter, presidential scholar, valedictorian, a girl who should have been planning her dorm room at Jefferson University, was slinging hash and refilling coffee cups for $11 an hour. The absurdity of it, the sheer tragic waste, settled into Daniel's chest like a stone. He turned off the engine and walked toward the entrance, his war coat feeling increasingly ridiculous with each step. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, and the smell hit him immediately. Burnt coffee, fryer grease, industrial cleaner, and underneath it all, desperation. A waitress with kind, tired eyes and a name tag reading Dottie approached with a laminated menu. "Just you, hun. Sit anywhere you like." Daniel chose a corner booth, the kind with cracked red vinyl and a view of the entire floor. He ordered black coffee and nothing else, then settled in to watch. And that's when he saw her. Emily Carter moved through the diner like a ghost, like someone whose soul had left their body, but the body hadn't gotten the message yet. Her blonde hair was hidden under a regulation hairnet, and she wore a brown polyester uniform 2 sizes too big, with a name tag that said Patty in faded red letters, someone else's name, someone else's life. Because even here she was invisible, erased, replaced. She carried a heavy brown tray on one thin arm, balancing plates and glasses with the mechanical precision of someone running on autopilot. No smile, no small talk. Just the grim efficiency of a person trying to make it through the next hour. And then the hour after that, and then the long cold walk home to check if her mother had fallen, if the medicine was working, if tomorrow would be the day everything finally collapsed. Daniel watched her for 20 minutes, nursing his bitter coffee, and every detail carved itself into his memory. The way she winced when she lifted a full bus tub of dirty dishes. The way she kept her eyes down, never making contact with customers, never inviting conversation. The way her hands shook slightly when she wrote down orders, exhaustion making even simple tasks difficult. And then there was the manager, short, angry-looking man in a stained white shirt with Mitch embroidered over the pocket who barked at her from behind the counter with the casual cruelty of someone who de-learned that powerless people make excellent targets. Miller. Table 6 needs water. Move it. Emily just nodded and kept moving, her face blank, absorbing the abuse like it was weather she couldn't change. This was what $900 a month cost. This was the price of keeping a mother alive in a country that treated healthcare like a luxury item. And Daniel, sitting in his corner booth with his untouched coffee, felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Pure, uncomplicated rage. Emily was clearing the booth next to his, her arms overloaded with plates crusted with ketchup and half-eaten burgers, when Daniel decided he'd seen enough. "Emily," he said, his voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the diner's ambient noise like a knife through butter. She froze. The clatter of dishes in her hands stopped. She turned slowly, mechanically, her exhausted brain taking a moment to process what her ears had just heard. When her eyes found him sitting there in his expensive coat, when recognition finally hit. Her face went through a series of transformations that would be been funny if they weren't so heartbreaking. Confusion, recognition, horror, shame. She looked at him. She looked at her greasy uniform. She looked at the half-eaten food on her tray, and the overloaded dishes, already precarious, slipped from her trembling hands. The crash was spectacular. Plates shattered against the linoleum floor with the sound of 1,000 small disasters happening at once. Glass exploded. Ketchup and lettuce and cold French fries splattered across the white tile like abstract art. The entire diner went silent. Every conversation stopping mid-sentence. Every head turning to look at the girl standing frozen in a spreading pool of broken things. Miller, the manager's roar, came from behind the counter, his face turning the color of raw meat. "What do you think you're doing? That's coming out of your pay. You hear me? A week's wages for breakage. You stupid. That's enough." Daniel's voice was quiet, cold, heavy with an authority that came from 68 years of making men twice Mitch's size back down across boardroom tables. He stood from his booth and walked slowly across the diner, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass, until he was standing directly between the manager and Emily, blocking her from view. Mitch, who'd been mid-rant, suddenly looked up, really looked tanned, saw not a customer, but something else entirely. A man who clearly didn't belong in the Midnight Star diner. A man whose watch cost more than Mitch made in 6 months. A man whose face carried the kind of power that didn't need to shout. "Who the hell are you?" Mitch blustered, though his voice had already lost its edge. "This is my employee," Daniel said, pulling out his leather wallet with deliberate slowness. "A child who is clearly unwell." He extracted $300 bills and dropped them on the counter with the disdain of someone paying off a parking ticket. "That's for the plates. And for my coffee. And for the inconvenience." Mitch's eyes went wide. His hand shot out and grabbed the money before it could disappear. Daniel turned his back on Himmer, complete dismissal, and crouched down to where Emily had collapsed to her knees. Her hands already picking up broken glass with her bare fingers, tears streaming silently down her face. "Emily," Daniel said gently, his knees protesting the movement, but his voice steady. "Get up, we're leaving." "I can't." She whispered, the words choked and broken. "My shift, I need this job. Your shift is over." He offered his hand. The same hand that had signed billion-dollar contracts, that had built an empire, that was now reaching out to a girl sitting in broken plates and spilled food on a diner floor. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she put her small, greasy hand in his. Daniel pulled her to her feet and guided her toward the door, one arm around her shoulders, shielding her from the stares of the other patrons. "Wait," Mitch called, suddenly realizing he was losing cheap labor. "She can't just..." Daniel paused at the door and looked back. "She's finished here, and the way you treat your employees." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but the implication was clear. "I see what you're doing, and it's over." Then he pushed open the glass door and walked Emily Carter out into the cold October night, leaving the Midnight Star diner and its broken plates and its small-time tyrant behind. The truth had just walked out of the shadows, and it was wearing a 17-year-old girl's face. There's something about watching someone finally intervene, finally step in when everyone else is content to look away, that hits different. Maybe it's because most of us have been Emily at some point, stuck in a bad situation, too proud or too scared to ask for help, just trying to survive until tomorrow. Or maybe we've been the people in those other booths, seeing something wrong and telling ourselves it's not our business. Either way, when someone decides that enough is enough, when dignity gets restored in front of everyone who stayed silent, something inside us responds. If that moment landed for you, if you felt that click of yes, this is what should happen, let it be known. Because stories like this only matter if people actually care about them. The sedan was warm, almost too warm after the cold October night, but Emily couldn't stop shaking. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands clasped in her lap, still greasy from the diner floor, staring straight ahead at the dashboard clock like it held answers to questions she couldn't articulate. 11:47 p.m. She hadn't said a word since Daniel had guided her out of the Midnight Star. Hadn't looked at him, hadn't asked where they were going. She just sat there vibrating with a silent, terrible shame that was somehow worse than any words could be. Daniel drove carefully through the empty Boston streets, his large hands resting lightly on the wheel, giving her space, giving her time. The only sound was the rhythmic thump of the wipers clearing a light mist from the windshield. He'd seen men break down in boardrooms after losing everything, their companies, their fortunes, their reputations, but he'd never seen anything quite like the defeat radiating from this 17-year-old girl who'd just been rescued from a job she should never have needed in the first place. "Your hands," Daniel said finally, his voice quiet, careful. "Are they cut?" Emily flinched at the sound, startled out of whatever dark place her mind had retreated to. "What? The glass? When the plate broke? Are you cut?" She slowly unclenched her fists and looked down like she was seeing her hands for the first time. There was a thin, dark line of blood across her right palm, welling up slowly. I don't know. It's fine." Daniel sighed and pulled the car over to the curb on a quiet, tree-lined street. He put it in park and turned on the interior light soft yellow, like a reading lamp. In that gentle glow, he could see her clearly, face smudged with dirt and tears, hair matted where the hairnet had pressed it flat, the small cut on her hand bleeding steadily. She looked at him with wide, confused eyes. "What are you doing?" "This will sting," Daniel said, ignoring her question. He reached into the glove compartment. His car was always organized, always prepared, and pulled out a small black first aid kit. He opened it, extracted an antiseptic wipe and a bandage. "Give me your hand." "No, it sits fine, really. I'm getting grease on your car." She tried to hide her hands under her legs. "Emily." His voice was gentle, but held that steel core she was learning, meant no negotiation. "Give me your hand." She hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly held out her trembling hand. Daniel took it. His own hand was warm and surprisingly soft, despite decades of work, but his grip was firm, steady. The grip of someone who wouldn't let go until the job was finished. He held her small, chapped hand in his and carefully blotted the blood, then opened the antiseptic wipe. She hissed when the alcohol touched the cut, her whole body going tense. "I told you," Daniel said, his eyes focused on his work. "A little sting now is better than infection later. My brother Tommy used to say that. He worked with precise, almost tender care, cleaning the cut thoroughly before wrapping the bandage around her palm. His movements weren't rushed, weren't perfunctory. He was treating this small wound like it mattered, like she mattered, and that kindness, that unexpected, unearned kindness, broke through Emily's carefully constructed walls faster than any interrogation could have. A single hot tear spilled over and ran down her cheek, then another. Daniel finished with the bandage and handed her a clean folded handkerchief from his coat pocket, the kind men of his generation still carried. "For your face," he said, not looking at her, giving her privacy in her breakdown. He put the car back in gear and pulled into the street. She wiped her face with the soft cloth. "Thank you," she whispered, the words small and hoarse. "You're welcome." They drove in silence for several blocks. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "Georgetown. That's the plan, isn't it? Or it was." Emily's hands clenched the handkerchief. "Jefferson University, actually in Washington." Why? The question was simple, but impossibly large. "I like history. And government. I thought I could work in the State Department or something." "Public service. Noble goal," Daniel said. "Difficult to achieve if you're not actually in school." The shame came rushing back, hot and sharp, making Emily's chest tight. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," Daniel said, his voice still reasonable, still patient. "I see a young woman, a U.S. presidential scholar, the valedictorian of her class, who has a full scholarship to a fine university, and she throws it all in the trash." I didn't throw it away. The words came out sharp. Sudden, all the anger she'd been holding at the unfairness of the world finally finding a target. "I didn't. What was I supposed to do?" And then she was crying openly, really crying for the first time since this nightmare had started, the sobs shaking her whole body. What choice did I have? I came home from school. I'd just got in the letter, the one from the White House, and I was so happy. I ran inside and Mom was on the floor. She couldn't get up. She was in so much pain, she couldn't even cry. Daniel's knuckles went white on the steering wheel, but he didn't interrupt. The doctor said lupus, aggressive. He said the old medicine wasn't working. He said she needed something new, something better, but the insurance won't pay. It's $900 every month just for the pills. That's not even the doctor visits or the blood work, or she wiped her nose with his handkerchief, past caring about appearances. She lost her other job. Your job cleaning your house, that's all we have left. The paycheck and the insurance, even though the insurance doesn't cover what she actually needs. I saw her trying to scrub your floors and she just cried because her hands hurt so much. She was going to get fired. We were going to lose the apartment. We were going to lose everything. Her voice dropped to a whisper. So I put the letter in the trash. I called the school and told them I wasn't coming back. I blocked the principal's number on Mum's phone so she couldn't call and tell her what I'd done. And I started working covering Mum's shifts at your house for free so your assistant wouldn't notice she was sick, and taking the evening shift at the diner because it paid $11 an hour and I almost had enough saved up. I just needed one more week. She was spent, hollow, the confession leaving her empty. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. I hate it, she whispered. I hate every second of it. But I love my mum. I couldn't go to history class and write papers about policy while my mum was dying. What's a scholarship if I lose my mum? What's any of it worth if she's gone? Daniel was silent. He drove through the dark streets, processing, understanding finally the full weight of what this child had been carrying. This wasn't a girl making bad choices. This was a soldier on a battlefield making the only tactical decision available, fighting a war she was always going to lose. Because the enemy poverty disease, an indifferent healthcare system had infinite resources and she had none. He pulled up in front of Maplewood Towers, the same grey building he'd left an hour ago. You're very much like your mother, Daniel said quietly. Emily looked at him, confused. You both lied to me. She tried to hide her illness, to protect her job, to protect you. You lied to protect her. You're a family of terrible liars. A small, watery smile almost touched Emily's lips. You're also both very proud, Daniel continued. And your pride is costing you your future. It's costing your mother her health. It's our problem, Emily said. We'll figure it out. I'll pay you back for the plates. I don't know how yet. Stop talking about the plates, Daniel said, and there was annoyance in his voice now. The plates don't matter. The diner doesn't matter. The $900 doesn't matter. It matters to us. It does not matter, he repeated, and this time his voice was absolute, final. Get out of the car. We're going to see your mother. Because some truths needed to be heard by everyone involved, and some decisions couldn't be made by children trying to be adults, and some debts 50 years old and carried across continents and generations were finally coming due. Stories like this one don't end at a single moment of rescue. The real question is what happens next, how someone rebuilds a life that got torn apart by circumstances they never asked for, and whether there's actually such a thing as paying forward a debt that old, that deep, that tangled up in war and loss and letters written to strangers. If that's the kind of question that keeps pulling at something in your chest, the kind that makes stories matter more than just entertainment, then staying connected to see how it resolves might be worth consideration. Because the next part where all these pieces finally come together is where everything changes. The walk up the 3 flights of stairs felt different this time. Emily went first, her shoulders slumped in exhausted surrender, no longer trying to hide anything because there was nothing left to hide. Daniel followed, a steady, implacable presence, and when Emily fumbled with the key, her bandaged hand making it difficulty, waited patiently while she finally got the door opened. Inside, Linda was sitting exactly where Daniel had left her an hour ago, wrapped in a thin blanket on the sofa, her swollen hands clutching a tissue. She'd clearly been crying, clearly been waiting, imagining every possible terrible outcome. When she saw Emily walk through the door in that greasy diner uniform, still smudged with ketchup and shame, Linda gasped like she'd been punched. "Emily, oh baby, what happened? Are you hurt?" Then she saw Daniel filling the doorway behind her daughter, and Linda's face transformed from maternal concern to profound, bone-deep terror. She tried to stand, tried to be the employee receiving her boss, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She sank back down, defeated. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what to say." Daniel stepped fully into the small, cold apartment and closed the door with quiet finality. "She's been working the night shift at a diner," he said, not cruelly but with the weight of undeniable fact. "To pay for your medicine, the medicine you didn't tell me you needed." The truth hung in the frigid air, stark and ugly. Linda looked at Emily. Emily looked at the floor. The house of cards they'd built from lies, and desperation and love had finally collapsed, and now they both stood in the rubble, waiting for judgment. "You told him." Linda whispered to her daughter, and the betrayal in her voice was almost worse than anger would have been. "He was there," Emily said, her voice breaking. "At the diner, I dropped a tray. I broke everything. Mum, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology was for so much more than broken plates. It was for failing, for getting caught, for not being strong enough to keep the secret just a little bit longer. Emily rushed to the sofa and collapsed, burying her head in her mother's lap like a child, sobbing. Linda wrapped her twisted, painful arms around her daughter and held her, stroking her hair with hands that barely worked anymore. She looked up at Daniel with tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Please," Linda begged, and the word carried the weight of every desperate prayer she'd ever prayed. "Please don't punish her. It's my fault. All of it. I got sick. I couldn't keep up. I'm so sorry. I'll pay for whatever she broke. I'll work for free. Just please, please don't call the police. Don't hurt my daughter. Daniel looked at these two women clinging to each other in a sea of medical bills and disconnected utilities and impossible choices, and he felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't pity, was too condescending, too distant. It was recognition. He'd seen this before, this kind of love that sacrificed everything, this kind of desperation that made people noble and foolish and brave all at once. He'd seen it in his own mother's eyes when the telegram came about Tommy. Hurt her, Daniel said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Mrs. Carter, I'm not here to hurt her. I'm here to stop you from hurting her. Linda looked up, confusion cutting through her terror. What? Your pride. Her pride. You're letting it destroy her entire future. Her brilliant, extraordinary future. Daniel walked over to the single worn armchair and sat down, and suddenly he wasn't here the imposing billionaire anymore. He was just an old man in a cold room, tired and determined. This is what's going to happen, he said, and he wasn't asking permission, wasn't negotiating. He was stating facts. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, a car will arrive here. It will take you, Linda, to Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore. I've already spoken with a specialist there, Dr. Raymond Ayers. He's the best in the country for your condition. He's also an old friend. Linda stared at him, her mouth open. I can teether cost I can tea afford. You will not be discussing costs, Daniel said, cutting her off with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. You will be discussing your health. All of it. The transportation, the treatment, the medication, it's handled. It's paid for. But why? Linda's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you? Daniel held up a hand. I'm not finished, Emily. Emily lifted her tear-stained face from her mother's lap. My assistant Harold will be at Harbor Ridge High School at 8:30 tomorrow morning. He'll meet with your principal. He'll explain the family medical emergency that caused your absence. He'll arrange for you to take your final exams. You will graduate. Your truancy record will be corrected. Emily's eyes went wide with disbelief. But the scholarship pie missed the deadline. It's gone. They gave it to someone else. Deadlines, Daniel said, and a thin, rare smile touched his lips, are often just suggestions for people who know how to ask the right questions. Harold is very persuasive. He's already been in contact with the admissions office at Jefferson University. You will accept your scholarship. You will go to Washington in the fall. That is not negotiable. The room fell silent. Mother and daughter just stared at this man who had, in the space of 2 minutes, solved problems that had been crushing them for months. Linda found her voice first. Mr. Whitmore, this is charity. We can't accept this. It's too much. We don't deserve it. Is not charity, Daniel said, and his voice carried a weight that made both women stop breathing. He leaned forward, his eyes searching Linda's face. I came here this afternoon and saw something I recognized. A photograph by your Dora man in uniform, Army, the 101st Airborne. Linda's hand went to her throat. My father, Captain James Carter. Daniel nodded slowly. I thought so, I had to be sure. He paused, gathering words he hadn't spoken in 50 years. I had an older brother named Thomas, Tommy. He was everything I wasn't: loud, funny, fearless. I was in college studying business when he enlisted. 101st Airborne, Baker Company. Linda's eyes widened. That was my father's company. Yes, Daniel said. Tommy didn't come home. He was 20 years old. It destroyed my mother, broke our family into pieces we never quite put back together. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had built an empire but couldn't save his brother. After it happened, my mother just faded, stopped eating, stopped talking, just sat by the window waiting for something that would never come. Then a letter arrived, from your father, from Captain James Carter. Daniel's voice caught, and he had to stop, had to breathe through the memory. He wrote about Tommy. He said my brother was brave. He described how Tommy had saved 2 other men, how he'd died making sure they got out. But more than that, Daniel looked up at Linda, his eyes bright with tears he hadn't shed in decades. He wrote that he'd held Tommy's hand, that my brother wasn't alone, that he was proud to have served with him. Your father wrote 3 letters, Mrs. Carter, to a woman he'd never met, about a boy he'd known for 6 months, and those letters his voice broke. Those letters were the only thing that kept my mother alive. They gave us Tommy back. Not his body, but his memory, his honor, his final moments. That was a gift beyond price. He reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. From a worn, hidden fold, he extracted a small, creased photographer, same one from his study bookshelf. Young men in jungle fatigues, exhausted but smiling, arms around each other. He handed it to Linda with trembling hands. She took it, gasping. That's my father," she whispered, pointing to a stern-faced captain with kind eyes. "And that," Daniel said, pointing to the grinning young man beside him, "is my brother Tommy." Emily leaned in, seeing her grandfather young and vital, seeing the connection that had been invisible until this moment. Daniel's voice was steady now, resolved. "Your father left no one behind, not his men, not even their memory." And now he looked at Emily, at her exhausted face, at her grandfather's eyes. "I've been a very wealthy man for a very long time, but I've carried a debt I could never repay. A debt to your father for his kindness, for his honor, for giving my family peace when we had none." He stood up. "This is not charity. This is family. This is a debt 50 years overdue. Your grandfather saved my family, Linda. Now let me help his..." The shadows had finally given way to truth, and in that cold apartment, 3 lives that had been tangled in the past were finally, impossibly, finding their way toward light. The thing about debts like this is that they transcend money, transcend time, transcend everything we normally think of as transactional. They're debts of honor, of memory, of refusing to let good people be forgotten when they do something decent in the middle of hell. And maybe that something we lost track of in modern life, their idea that what we do echoes forward in ways we never see. That a letter written in 1970 can save a girl in 2025, that paying attention to suffering actually matters. If that resonates, if this kind of connection across generations makes sense to something deep in your chest, leave your thoughts below, because these conversations about honor, about seeing each other, about refusing to let people carry impossible burdens alone, these are the conversations that remind us what being human actually means. Some transformations happen slowly, over years of grinding effort and incremental progress. Others happen fast, like flipping a switch, and the world that was dark and cold and impossible suddenly floods with light and possibility. The 2 weeks that followed Daniel's intervention fell into the second category, not because problems disappeared overnight, but because someone finally had the resources and the will to actually solve them instead of just offering thoughts and prayers. At 9:00 a.m. the next morning, a black town car arrived at Maplewood Towers. The driver, professional and kind, helped Linda Carter into the back seat with her walker, and by noon she was sitting in a consultation room at Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, surrounded by specialists who treated her like a person rather than a billing code. Dr. Raymond Ayers, a silver-haired man with warm eyes and steady hands, spent an hour just listening to her story before he even looked at her chart. "Mrs. Carter," he said finally, his voice gentle but certain, "we're going to make this better. Your only job is to rest and let us work." For the first time in 2 months. Linda Carter slept without pain screaming through her joints, without fear screaming through her mind. Meanwhile, at 8:30 a.m., Harold Benson arrived at Harbor Ridge High School carrying a leather folder and the quiet authority of someone who spent 2 decades solving impossible problems for Daniel Whitmore. Principal Dorothy Evers rushed out of her office when she heard Emily Carter's name, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Emilio, thank God, we've been so worried." Harold opened the folder with practiced precision. "Mrs. Evers, I represent the Whitmore family. Emily has been serving as primary caregiver for her mother during a serious medical crisis. Here's documentation from Johns Hopkins confirming the diagnosis and treatment timeline." He slid the papers across her desk official letterhead. Doctors' signatures, the kind of documentation that transformed truancy into tragedy, failure into heroism. Mrs. Evers read quickly, her hand going to her mouth. "Lupus, aggressive. Oh, that poor child. Why didn't she tell us? We could have helped." "She didn't know how to ask," Harold said simply. "But we're correcting that now. We need to arrange her final examinations. She needs to graduate on time." And he paused, pulling out another document. We need to contact Jefferson University about reinstating her scholarship. I have a direct line to the Dean of Admissions. With your recommendation letter, we can make this right. Mrs. Evers didn't hesitate. I'll write it now. That girl, she's the best student I've seen in 30 years of teaching. If there's any justice in this world, she'll get that scholarship back. Harold smiled thinly. Justice is what we make it, Mrs. Evers. Let's get to work. Back at Maplewood Towers, something else was happening. The apartment that had been cold and dark for months suddenly came alive. At 10 a.m., a utility worker showed up and reconnected the gas line. The heater clicked on for the first time in weeks, flooding the rooms with warmth. An hour later, another worker restored the disconnected phone service. By noon, a grocery delivery arrived, not the bare essentials Linda had been stretching for months, but real food, fresh vegetables, protein, milk that wasn't powdered. The delivery person hauled in 6 bags and left them on the small kitchen counter, and when Emily came home from her meeting with the principal, she stood in the doorway staring at the abundance like it was a miracle, which, in a way, it was. The 2 weeks became a blur of small victories, accumulating into something larger. Linda stayed 3 days at Johns Hopkins while they adjusted her medication and taught her how to manage the disease. The swelling in her hands began to recede. The grey pallor of her skin started to pink up with actual circulation. She could stand without the walker for short periods. She could hold a coffee cup without crying. Emily, meanwhile, studied it. She sat at the small desk in her bedroom, now warm, now quiet. Now safe and opened textbooks she'd thought she'd never see again. Harold arranged for her to take condensed final exams over the course of a week, proctored by Mrs. Evers personally. Emily attacked those tests with the focused intensity of someone who'd been drowning and suddenly found air. She aced every single one. Harold, true to his word, was persuasive. He spent 2 hours on the phone with Jefferson University's admissions office, explaining the situation, providing documentation, leveraging Daniel's considerable reputation. The scholarship had been awarded to an alternate candidate, yes. But that candidate had also received a full ride to Yale and was planning to attend there instead. The spot was available. Emily Carter's record was impeccable. The decision was reversed. By the end of the second week, Emily received a thick envelope in the mail, the kind that means yes, the kind she'd thrown away once and never thought she'd see again. She opened it at the kitchen table while her mother watched, and when she read the words, "We are pleased to confirm your full scholarship," she put her head down on that table and cried for 20 minutes straight. But this time, they were different tears. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of impossible things becoming possible again. Linda reached across the table with hands that could finally move without agony and held her daughter's hand, and neither of them said anything because there weren't words big enough for what they were feeling. 2 weeks, that's all it took when someone with resources decided to actually care. when the machinery of institutions was pointed toward helping instead of hindering, when the truth came out of the shadows and someone with power said, "No, this isn't acceptable, and I'm going to fix it." And if that sounds too neat, too easy, too much like a fairy tale, remember this: the only reason it worked was because Emily and Linda had done everything right first. Emily had earned that scholarship through years of relentless work. Linda had raised a daughter with character and courage, and both of them had fought with everything they had before Daniel ever showed up. He didn't save them. He just made it possible for them to save themselves. There's a difference, and it matters. The question this chapter raises, the one that probably sits uncomfortable in a lot of people's chests, is simple. How many Emilys and Lindas are out there right now, doing everything right, fighting impossible odds, and losing anyway because nobody with resources is paying attention? How many presidential scholars are washing dishes at 3 a.m. because $900 a month might as well be $9 million. Sharing stories like this won't solve systemic problems overnight. But it does something equally important. Reminds people to look, to see, to ask the question, why is that pattern broken, instead of walking past it. If that feels worth doing, well, the share button exists for a reason. The day of graduation arrived bright and hot, the kind of June morning that promised a long summer ahead, the kind that made everything feel possible. Harbour Ridge High School's football field had been transformed into a ceremony, space rows of white folding chairs stretching across the artificial turf. A temporary stage draped in blue and gold, and hundreds of parents and grandparents and siblings crowding into the metal bleachers. Phones ready to capture the moment their kids walked across that stage toward whatever came next. Emily Carter sat on the stage in her blue graduation gown. The honor cord, that same blue and gold cord that had started all of this, draped around her neck like vindication. She looked out at the sea of faces and found them in the third row, her mother, Lupus, sitting in a wheelchair not because she couldn't tea-walk, but because the day was long and Dr. Ayers had insisted on caution, and beside her, Daniel Whitmore, Linda, looked transformed. The grey pallor was gone, replaced by colour that spoke of proper medication and proper food and sleep, that wasn't tea interrupted by pain every 2 hours. Her hair was done, she wore a dress that actually fit, and her smile, Lord, her smile was so bright, so fierce with maternal pride that Emily could feel it from 50 feet away. Daniel sat next to her in a simple grey suit, looking more like a grandfather than a billionaire, his hands folded in his lap. When his eyes met Emily's across the crowd, he didn't smile. He simply nodded. One sharp, respectful nod that said, "Your day, your moment, your victory." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her speech. The one she'd written and rewritten a dozen times. The one that talked about perseverance and the future and all the safe, expected things valedictorians were supposed to say. Principal Evers stood at the podium, working through the program with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this ceremony 30 times. Diplomas were distributed, names were called, families cheered. The sun beat down on the artificial turf, making the air shimmer, and then Mrs. Evers adjusted the microphone and said the words Emily had been both dreading and anticipating. And now to deliver the valedictory address with a perfect 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship to Jefferson University in Washington, D.C., please welcome Emily Carter. The applause was loud and genuine. Emily's classmates, most of whom had no idea where she'd been for those missing 25 days, clapped and cheered. She stood, her legs surprisingly steady, and walked to the podium. She placed her carefully written speech on the wooden surface and looked out at the crowd. At her mother, tears already streaming down her face. At Daniel, still and attentive. At Mrs. Evers, who'd spent 2 hours on a Saturday writing a recommendation letter that probably saved Emily's future. At Harold Benson, standing in the back, arms crossed, watching with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a difficult case. Emily looked down at her speech. 5 pages of polished prose about reaching for dreams and overcoming obstacles and being the change. All true, all safe, all completely insufficient for what she actually needed to say. She folded the pages and put them in her pocket. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was clear, steady, amplified across the field. "I wrote a speech about the future, but I don't want to talk about that." She gripped the sides of the podium. "I want to talk about what happens when you can't see a future, when you're so buried in the present, in just trying to survive one more day. That planning for next year feels like a cruel joke." The crowd had gone quiet, sensing this wasn't going to be a typical graduation speech. We think of history as something made by big, important people, by presidents and billionaires and generals. But history is also made by small choices, by people who are tired and scared but choose to do the right thing anyway. By a soldier who writes letters to a grieving mother he's never met. By a mother who would rather disappear than burden her child. By her voice caught, and she had to pause, breathe, continue. By strangers who decide that your suffering matters, that you're not invisible, that the patterns that are broken deserve to be fixed. She wasn't reading from notes anymore. She was speaking from somewhere deeper. "A month ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade, sacrificed a future that couldn't be recovered. And I was okay with that choice because real love doesn't do math. It doesn't weigh costs and benefits. It just acts. It shows up at 3 in the morning. It throws scholarships in the trash, if that's what survival requires." Emily looked directly at Daniel, but then someone noticed. Someone paid attention when it would have been easier to look away. Someone remembered that his own family had been saved by kindness 50 years ago, and he decided to pay that forward. To refuse to let history stop, to prove that the debts of honor don't expire just because time passes. Tears were running down her face now, but she didn't stop. So when you leave here today, when you go out into whatever comes next, remember this: you're going to see broken patterns. You're going to see people washing dishes at 3 in the morning when they should be in school. You're going to see families choosing between medicine and rent. And you'll have a choice to look away because it's not your problem, or to look closer to ask why. To be the person who decides that enough is enough. She pulled the White House letter from inside her gown. The same letter she'd thrown in the trash, now carefully preserved. This letter says I'm one of the top students in the nation. But the truth is, I almost wasn't a student at all. I almost disappeared into the shadows where nobody would have noticed or cared. The only reason I'm standing here is because someone refused to let that happen. So I'm asking y'all of you, don't just be successful. Be the kind of person who notices. Be the kind of person who acts. Be the kind of person who refuses to leave anyone behind. The stadium exploded in applause. Not polite graduation applause, but the kind that comes from somewhere real, that acknowledges truth when it's finally spoken aloud. Emily looked out at the crowd through her tears and saw her mother sobbing, saw Daniel Whitmore with his hand over his heart, saw Mrs. Evers wiping her eyes, saw her classmates on their feet. And she understood, finally, that her future hadn't been bought or given or rescued. It had been earned through love and sacrifice and the willingness of good people to see each other across impossible distances. The truth had won. The shadows had lost. And that, Emily thought as she walked back to her seat through the thunder of applause, was the only lesson that really mattered. There's something about watching someone stand up and tell the truth in a place that usually traffics in platitudes and safe inspirational quotes that cuts through all the noise. Most graduation speeches get forgotten before the reception line forms. But the ones that name the real struggle, that honor the people who showed up in the darkness, that challenge everyone listening to actually be better instead of just feel better, those stick. If this one stuck with something in your chest, if Emily's speech said something worth remembering, acknowledging that matters, because stories like this only change things when people actually respond to them. 3 months after graduation, on a cool September morning, Linda Carter stood in Daniel Whitmore's study not as a housekeeper, but as something else entirely. She'd gained 20 pounds of healthy weight. Her hands moved without constant pain. Daniel sat behind his mahogany desk, watching her with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally solved a puzzle that had haunted him for 50 years. On the desk between them sat a leather portfolio embossed with gold lettering. The Baker Company Fund. "You're certain about this?" Linda asked, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "Running a charitable foundation it's not what I was trained for, Mr. Whitmore." "Call me Daniel," he said, and it was the first time he'd made that offer to anyone on his staff in 2 decades. "And you're exactly who should run it. You understand what it means to fall through the cracks, to do everything right and still lose. You'll know which families need help and which ones are just working the system. The Baker Company Fund had been his idea, conceived during one of those sleepless nights that now came less frequently. It was simple in structure but profound in purpose, a permanent endowment to provide small emergency grants to descendants of military veterans, specifically those who served in the 101st Airborne, though Daniel planned to expand it eventually. Not massive amounts, not life-changing fortunes, just the kind of help that caught people before they fell completely. 3 months of rent when a parent got sick, $1,000 for car repairs that meant the difference between keeping and losing a job, $900 a month for medication that insurance. Companies deemed experimental, the gaps that destroyed families filled before the destruction became permanent. The board meets quarterly, Daniel continued, sliding the portfolio across the desk. You'll have full discretion on grants under $10,000. Anything larger requires board approval, but I suspect you'll learn quickly that the small amounts are usually what matters most. Harold will handle the legal and financial structure. Your job is to find the families and decide who gets helped. Linda opened the portfolio with trembling hands. Not from disease now, but from the weight of responsibility. Inside were photographs. Captain James Carter in his dress uniform, young and stern and kind. Tommy Whitmore grinning in jungle fatigues. A letter on yellowed paper, dated 1970, written in careful handwriting. "My father's letter," Linda whispered, recognizing the handwriting she'd seen in old boxes in her parents' attic. "One of the 3 he sent my mother," Daniel confirmed. "I've carried it for 50 years, waiting for a chance to pay it forward." This fund's not charity, Linda, it's keeping a promise. Your father wrote that Baker Company left no one behind. This makes sure their families don't get left behind either. Linda looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll run it. Say you'll help me turn that old promise into something that lasts longer than both of us." She closed the portfolio carefully, like it was sacred. "Yes, I'll do it. I'll do it right." Daniel nodded, satisfied. "I know you will." Outside the study window, a car pulled up to the circular driveway, a taxi, yellow and ordinary, come to take Emily to the train station. She was leaving for Washington, D.C., for Jefferson University, for the future that had almost been stolen from her. Daniel stood. "We should say goodbye." They found Emily on the front steps, a single suitcase beside her, that same faded blue backpack slung over one shoulder. But she'd added something to it, the honor cord still attached to the zipper, and a small framed photo D1. Daniel had given her of Captain James Carter and Tommy Whitmore with their arms around each other in that distant jungle. She looked up when she heard them approach, and Daniel saw not the exhausted, terrified girl from his kitchen at 3:00 a.m., but someone transformed, still young, still finding her way, but no longer carrying the world alone. "So," Daniel said, his hands in his pockets, trying for casual and not quite achieving it, "Washington. Yes, sir, Emily said, and then corrected herself with a small smile. Yes, Daniel. He'd insisted she drop the formalities. Nervous, terrified, she admitted, but the good kind. The kind that means something matters. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wrapped package. For your dorm room. Consider it a graduation gift, 3 months late. Emily unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a laptop new, expensive, the kind that would last her through 4 years of papers and research. And tucked into the case was something else, a second photograph, this one of all 4 of them taken at graduation. Linda in her wheelchair, Daniel beside her, Emily in her gown, Harold's standing slightly apart, but smiling. So you remember, Daniel said quietly, that you're not alone. Not anymore. Not ever again. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She stepped forward and hugged him quick, fierce, the kind of hug that said things words couldn't. Daniel, caught off guard, patted her back awkwardly. He wasn't used to this, but he found he didn't mind. The taxi driver honked gently. Time to go. Emily picked up her suitcase, shouldered her backpack, and looked at her mother. You'll call me every Sunday. Every Sunday. Linda promised. And you'll actually answer. Linda laughed. Now that we have a phone that works, yes, I'll answer. Emily looked at Daniel one more time. Thank you doesn't cover it. I don't have words that cover it. Then don't try, Daniel said. Just go be extraordinary. That's payment enough. Emily nodded, climbed into the taxi, and the car pulled away, carrying her toward a future that had been saved, not given. Linda and Daniel stood side by side on the steps, watching until the taxi disappeared around the bend. She'll be fine, Linda said. Better than fine, Daniel agreed. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Linda asked quietly, Do you think they know? Your brother and my father. Wherever they are, do you think they know what happened here? Daniel thought about that. About letters written 50 years ago. About debts that transcend death. About patterns that connect generations. I think they do, he said finally. I think they've been watching this whole time, waiting for us to figure it out. That night, for the first time in decades, Daniel Whitmore slept without insomnia, without the weight of unpaid debts pressing on his chest. The shadows that had haunted him since 1970 had finally receded. The truth had won. And in a cold apartment that was now warm, Linda Carter sat at her small desk, opened the Baker Company Fund portfolio, and began reading the first applicationer single mother whose son needed medication she couldn't afford. Linda smiled, picked up her pen, and wrote, Approved. The cycle continued. The promise kept. No one left behind. Stories like this one matter not because they're unusual, but because they're proof that the patterns can be broken, that the impossible can bend, that debts of honor still mean something even in a world that's forgotten how to talk about honor without irony. If you want more stories like this about real people making hard choices, about truth winning in the shadows, about the connections that make us human, then staying connected means you want to miss them when they show up. Because these stories are everywhere, waiting to be told. You just have to be willing to look. 5 years later, on a crisp November morning, Daniel Whitmore stood at the back of a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C., watching something he never thought he'd live to see. The room was filled with 200 people, families, students, veterans, ordinary Americans who'd been drowning and were pulled back from the edge. They'd come from 38 states, flown or driven or taken buses through the night. Because today was the 5th anniversary gala of the Baker Company Fund, and every single person in that room owed their presence to a promise made in a jungle 50 years ago and kept in a cold apartment 5 years back. Daniel was 73 now, moving a bit slower, but his eyes were still sharp, still cataloguing patterns, and the pattern he saw today was beautiful beyond measure. On stage, Linda Carter no longer frail, no longer afraid. Now, the confident executive director of a foundation that had distributed over $12 million in emergency grants was introducing the keynote speaker. 5 years ago, Linda said, her voice carrying across the auditorium with authority. I was sitting in a cold apartment, watching my daughter throw away her future to keep me alive, and I thought that was just how the world worked. That good people sacrificed and suffered and nobody noticed. But one man did notice. One man remembered that his family had been saved by kindness decades earlier, and he refused to let that kindness die with the past. She paused, looking directly at Daniel in the back row. He shook his head slightly. This wasn't about him, but she smiled and continued anyway. Today, this fund has helped 847 families. We've kept kids in school. We've kept parents in treatment. We've kept the lights on and the heat running and the medications flowing. And every single one of those families represents a future that didn't get thrown away, a dream that didn't get sacrificed, a person who didn't disappear into the shadows because someone finally noticed they were drowning. The applause was thunderous, but Linda held up her hand. But the real story isn't mine to tell. The real story belongs to the person who proved that what we started here wasn't just about being saved, it was about learning to save others. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Jefferson University graduate, currently serving as legislative aide to Senator Patricia Morrison, and my daughter Emily Carter. The crowd erupted as Emily walked onto the stage, no longer the exhausted 7-year-old washing dishes at 3:00 a.m., but a poised 22-year-old woman in a professional suit, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who de-earned every inch of ground she stood on. She'd graduated summa cum laude, turned down 3 prestigious corporate jobs, and chosen public service instead, working on healthcare policy reform, specifically on legislation to close the gaps that almost destroyed her family. She reached the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and her eyes found Daniel's in the back. She smiled, not the desperate smile of someone asking for help, but the grateful smile of someone who'd learned to help others. 5 years ago, Emily began, I was convinced my life was over. I'd thrown my scholarship in the trash, dropped out of school, and was working a night shift at a diner for $11 an hour, trying to scrape together $900 for my mom's medication. I'd made my choice survival over dreams, the present over the future, and I was okay with that choice because love doesn't do cost-benefit analysis. It just acts. She gripped the podium, but then something happened that I didn't think was possible in America anymore. Someone noticed. Someone with resources and power looked at a broken pattern and decided to fix it instead of walking past it. And not just for me, for hundreds of others. Because Daniel Whitmore understood something that took me years to fully grasp, that being saved isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Emily pulled out a folder, and on the screen behind her, photographs began to appear. This is Marcus Henderson, she said, pointing to a photo of a young black man in a cap and gown. His grandmother is a Vietnam veteran. 2 years ago, Marcus was about to drop out of MIT because his grandmother needed dialysis, and they couldn't afford both tuition and treatment. The Baker Company Fund covered 6 months of her treatment. Marcus graduated last spring with a degree in biomedical engineering. He's now developing low-cost dialysis technology for rural communities. Click. Next photo. A young woman with bright eyes. This is Sarah Kim. Her grandfather served in the 101st last year. Sarah's father had a stroke. She was going to quit her nursing program to care for him full-time. The fund covered in-home care for 4 months. Sarah graduated. She's now an ICU nurse in Cleveland, saving lives every day because someone saved hers first. Click. Next photo. An older couple smiling on a porch. This is Maria and Roberto Sanchez. Roberto is a Gulf War veteran. Their roof collapsed during a storm. Insurance denied the claim. They were going to lose their house. The fund covered the repairs. They're still in that house. Their grandson just started college. Photo after photo, story after story. Lives that hadn't been lost, futures that hadn't been sacrificed, people who'd been drowning and were pulled back to shore. The auditorium was silent except for the occasional sound of someone crying. Here's what I learned, Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. Kindness isn't just something nice. It's not a luxury or a bonus feature of a good life. Kindness is infrastructure. It's the invisible support system that keeps society from collapsing into a nightmare where only the strong survive and everyone else gets ground into dust. And when someone builds that infrastructure, when someone says, I see you suffering and I am going to do something about it, the effects don't stop with one person. They ripple outward. They multiply. They become a wave. She looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel, you saved me 5 years ago. But you also saved Marcus and Sarah and Maria and Roberto and 843 other families who now have a chance to save others. You didn't just pay forward a debt from 50 years ago. You started a chain reaction that's going to echo for generations. And that her voice broke. That's what heroism actually looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, just persistent, quiet refusal to let good people drown when you have the power to throw them a rope. The entire auditorium rose in standing ovation. Emily stepped away from the podium, walked down the stage steps, and moved through the crowd directly to Daniel. He stood there, this old man who'd spent 50 years carrying guilt and grief, and she hugged him like he was family, because he was. "Thank you," she whispered in his ear, "for noticing, for caring, for proving that the world doesn't have to be cruel." Daniel, who hadn't cried since his brother's funeral in 1970, felt tears running down his weathered face. "Thank you for teaching an old man that debts of honor never expire," he whispered back, "and that the best way to honor the dead is to save the living." The applause continued. The flash of cameras captured the moment, and somewhere, in whatever place soldiers go when they leave this world, Captain James Carter and Private Tommy Whitmore looked down at the granddaughter and brother they'd never met, saw the wave of kindness spreading across a nation, and knew that their promise leave no one behind had finally, impossibly come home. Final CTA strong and direct. Listenif, you made it to the end of this story. If you felt something shift in your chest when Emily stood up and named all those lives that got saved, then you already know what I'm about to say. Stories like this matter, not because they're fairy tales, but because they're proof that the patterns can be broken. That one person paying attention can change everything. That the ripples we create do echo forward in ways we'll never fully see. This channel exists to tell these stories about truth winning in the shadows, about honor that transcends time, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they decide that someone else's suffering actually matters. And here's the thing. If you don't subscribe, if you don't hit that like button, if you don't share this with someone who needs to hear it, this story disappears. The algorithm buries it, and the next Emily Carter washing dishes at 3 a.m. never gets noticed, never gets saved, because the story that could have inspired someone to pay attention never reached them. So do me a favor, if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that kindness is infrastructure and that we all connected across impossible distances, subscribe to this channel. Like this video, drop a comment about a time someone noticed you drowning, or a time you threw someone a rope, and share it. Share it with your kids, your parents, your friends who've forgotten that the world can still be good. Because stories like this don't go viral by accident. They spread because people like you decide they're worth spreading. The Baker Company Fund is real. The ripples are real. And your decision right now to engage or to scroll past, that's real too. Be the person who notices. Be the person who acts. Hit subscribe. We've got more stories to tell, and you're not going to want to miss them.